All right, we're back for another coffee session. We are with none other than my man Vishnu, as always, and our guest of honor today is Sarah Catanzaro. Please correct me if I pronounced that incorrectly, Sarah, but it's great
Very
to have you
close.
in. I am professional at butchering names, so that is
Gosh, I,
what I do well.
I will not even try to pronounce like your full name, but Catanzaro. I am likewise very, very bad at names, and anything beyond like a one syllable lasting name probably means that if you put me on the spot to do either of your last names, I'd be like,
Yep, exactly. Well,
there.
so the idea here, I think it would be helpful for people to know a bit of background info on how this came about and why we are interviewing you. And for some reason or somehow in the Twitter world, I stumbled across your tweets, and you had a pretty epic tweet storm that was predicting or talking about what you thought is coming next in the ML world. And so when I saw that, I really thought there was a lot to dig in there. I enjoyed it so much. I reached out directly and said, "Hey, would you want to come on here? Do you think this is something interesting you want to talk about?" And instantly you said yes. So here we are. The tweet storm will leave a link to in the description because I think it needs to be immortalized. And I really enjoyed it. But before we jump into that and we talk today, I also think it might be useful for people to know a bit about your backstory. Like, how did you get to be where you are, and talk to us about what you're doing now?
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe I can start quickly with what I'm doing now and then kind of go into how I got there. So I'm a partner at Amplify Partners. We're an early stage venture capital firm, and we invest primarily in technical tools and platforms. So typically I talk about my investments across like three research disciplines, which would be primarily machine intelligence, distributed systems, and data management. But if I'm going to map that to industry, it's really data and ML tools and platforms, enterprise infrastructure, and developer and designer tools. We have this focus for a couple of reasons, and perhaps this is an opportunity for me to digress into my background. The first, most obvious reason is just that these are the categories we're most interested in. So before Amplify, I spent about a year and a half doing generalist investing. And I think I really realized that I was neither good nor very interested in investing in consumer products. I remember a investment team meeting where I said something along the lines of like, women will never buy cosmetics online. And clearly I was very wrong. But I just found that, instead of like gravitating towards, I don't know, ad tech or B2C marketplaces, I was just much more enticed by GPU accelerated databases and Kubernetes as a service. And a lot of that is grounded in my professional experience. So prior to moving into VC, I had spent about a decade in data science roles, initially in the defense and intelligence sector, using computational models to understand insurgencies and other national threats.
Oh, wow.
And then subsequently at startups, most recently leading the data team at a company called Mattermark. But yeah, going back to Amplify just quickly, I think, aside from the interest and alignment, with my past background, we also just realized that technical tool builders face a completely different set of challenges from most other companies. You have to think about like, what is your open source strategy, and do you need one? You're thinking about like, how do I manage these stakeholder management problems? Interestingly, a founder had pinged me last night and was like, okay, what are the different motivations of the ML engineering team versus the ML platform team? And I think the beauty of Amplify is that I can spend most of my time focusing on questions like this instead of understanding how to optimize supply chains for a mattress or furniture company, or thinking about like pricing dynamics in marketplaces and things like that. So yeah, how I got here. Long story short, Mattermark was selling data to investors, and one of our customers recruited me. But now I'm primarily investing in companies related to the data and ML stacks.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah. I've been following Amplify for a while, and I always, I found that I'm friends with one of the portfolio companies, Sin CEO, Yasif. And one of the things that strikes me about what you guys do is it's very engineering oriented. You guys really do seem to care a lot about the deep technical challenges that each company is trying to take on, whether it's OctoML, Runway, Flywheel, or any of the companies that you guys have invested in. How do you guys manage to stay engineer oriented despite being a professional investment firm?
That is actually a great question. And I'd say it's one that is like certainly top of mind for me, particularly as I spend more and more time in venture. As I had mentioned, I spent about a decade in operating roles in data science, but now I've spent about like half a decade in venture related roles. And so I want to ensure that like I continue to have both a strong sense of empathy with the technical buyer, technical founder, as well as a kind of strong understanding of the technical tools in which we invest. So for me, there's kind of two tactics that I've applied. The first is Projects to Know, which is a newsletter that I curate. Instead of focusing on kind of the to put it not so gently, like clickbait articles, ML is curing cancer, et cetera, et cetera. Projects to Know features with 3 research papers, 3 open source projects, and 3 pieces of content that are really related to practitioners. And so in curating that, I'm just constantly reading academic papers and looking through open source repos and things like that. And I do find that like that helps me stay abreast of technical trends. And then the other is actually through volunteer work. So to be honest, I don't think I could really invest and have the strongest conviction in the data and ML tools that we work with if I didn't continue to at least do some data work, which like totally keeps me grounded. So I'm the volunteer data lead for an organization called Allraise, which is focused on getting more diversity into the startup and venture ecosystem. And it's a constant reminder of like the challenges of interfacing with other teams and trying to wrangle additional resources, as well as like some of the more technical aspects in terms of, changing database schemas and data quality and things of that nature.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. I think in our community, in the MLOps community, we're about 3,500 people now, Demetrios. It's pretty crazy. One of the things that we always hear about is this curiosity from community members about how is it that venture sort of is related to our ecosystem, in the sort of tooling space. Always a lot of questions, and it's nice to hear your perspective about how you on the investment side, stay abreast of trends and keep up. And a related question that I sort of have is, I saw in your bio that you describe your investment thesis kind of as being around tools that you wish you had earlier in your career. And, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that plays out, what that means, and maybe even some examples of investments like that that you've had where you were like, man, I wish I had this tool back when I was head of data at Mattermark.
Yeah, absolutely. So the experience was pretty interesting at Mattermark because we really had a multidisciplinary data team. We had data analysts, we had data scientists, we had ML engineers, and even some software developers, DevOps people, designers working with the team. And so it was kind of this unique way of seeing how all of these different teams work together. I think one of the things, frankly, that disappoints me is that many of the challenges that I faced at Mattermark, even 5 years ago or 4 years ago, still exist today. I do try to kind of continue to test and validate my own experiences with peers and through some of the volunteer work, as I mentioned, to see how things are changing. But they're changing slowly. So to give an example, I'd say like one of the biggest challenges that I faced at Mattermark was monitoring our ML models. So we were using these NLP fact extraction models to collect data on startup funding events from news articles. And when those systems would go down, I would basically have to have my entire team come into the office early to read like 5,000 articles before our customers opened Mattermark in the morning. And unfortunately, like despite the best efforts of our team, I wouldn't say that they went down like super frequently, but it was probably at the very least a once a quarter thing. And sometimes, we had issues associated with data drift. Sometimes the issues were actually associated with the ML pipelines. Like I feel like the most common issue was a Mesos outage. But I wish there had been a way of kind of detecting and resolving those issues more proactively, such that I didn't have to have my team come in and read, 5,000 articles. So in many ways, this experience informed our investment in Flywheel. I think what they're doing is really powerful because you can leverage an evaluation store not just for monitoring, but also for kind of stabilizing those ML pipelines and addressing the issues such that you're not responding to an outage, you're actually kind of preventing that outage.
I'm sure everyone that you worked with loved Mesos after working there long enough. They probably jumped at the opportunity to change the Kubernetes, huh?
Yeah.
So you mentioned before when you were given that intro that you got pinged by a founder who wanted to know the different intentions or how the machine learning engineers differentiate, or I can't remember the exact question that was asked from the platform team. Like, what are the two motives that these two teams have? Right. What was the answer that you gave? I'm interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd start off by saying, what I shared with this founder, that most companies do not yet have an ML platform team. And so this is a very nascent discipline. I'd actually say that most companies probably don't even have a data platform team. And so I expect that the data platform team will kind of evolve first before they create an ML platform team. But when they do create an ML platform team, what I often find is that the ML platform team is composed of former ML engineers. So the pattern that I tend to see is that ML engineers encounter the same problem over and over again. And so ML platform is kind of a response to that observation. Are there ways in which we can resolve these challenges more systematically, so that we don't have to solve them repeatedly? So in many ways, the ML engineer and the ML platform engineer persona are very, very similar. I'd say the only difference that I found, and this is more relevant to startups, is that the ML platform team is going to have more of an impetus to build things rather than to buy things, since their raison d'etre is in fact to build.
Yeah, that makes sense. So
yeah, and I just want to jump in here because it's so interesting that we bring this up. One of the thesis, and there may be a blog post coming out about this from MLOps community, Dimitrios, is what I call the rise.
Vishnu.
Sorry.
Well, I think it was on you to write it, right?
Yeah. No, that's what I'm saying. I'm going to write it. That's why. I'm still writing it. That's all. It's titled "The Rise of the ML Platform Engineer," and that's because I think as an ML engineer myself, I have had the exact same experience that you're describing, right? Where traditionally for any machine learning problem that an engineer has to face, there's three components. What's the data? What's the model? How are we going to deploy it? And each problem ends up being a slight variant where, if you're just an ML engineer and you want to kind of, you're just a solo ML engineer, let's say, and you're tasked with solving a single problem, you might do a different thing for each one, a slightly different thing. But as soon as you hit a scale where you're confronting multiple problems, I think any ML engineer will say, well, is there a way I can do this in a more standardized way? Is there a way I can do this in a way that's similar across project? And boom, there you have an ML platform engineer. And that's actually the approach that we're taking hiring in our company. We're focusing first on the platform a little bit more because we have to go through an FDA clearance process and everything, building that. And then we're going to put the scientists on top of it. So kind of wanted to share that, completely understand the forces that you're talking about.
I'm glad that you got the title at least for the blog post. And that's an update from the last time that we talked. The rise of the ML platform engineer.
Writing the title and the conclusion is the hardest part. So I feel like you're 75% through.
There we go.
It'll be done as soon as you want, Demetrius. I'm almost there.
Exactly. Whenever it needs to be done. I'm not big into rushing things. Things need time, so take all the time you want, Vishnu. No.
Motto for ML in general, like things take time.
Exactly. Yeah, don't rush it or later you'll end up regretting it. So the other question that I was going to ask you, Sarah, is this idea of open sourcing. And sometimes to me, it feels like people open source or they go with open source models after the fact, and it doesn't feel authentic.
Yeah.
And so I would love to know your take on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I could probably spend like an entire day just talking about open source business models and like the various factors ranging from the political climate through security regulations that end up impacting them. So I find that companies will adopt open source business models or create open source projects for a range of reasons, some of which align with kind of the ethos of open source communities and some of which are not quite, a match. So I'll start with those first. Now, I think increasingly companies are adopting open source to address certain like security concerns and requirements, and also to give their potential users a sense of longevity. Now, with early stage startups, often larger companies are somewhat hesitant to work with them, particularly on key pieces of infrastructure, because they may be worried that the company will die. Most early stage startups do. And so they see the open source project as an artifact that can outlive the company, thereby creating more of a sense of stability. Similarly, open source software tends to have a lighter security review process than SaaS software or other deployment models. So there's that set of concerns. I'd say the next is actually open source software as a marketing and distribution channel. So increasingly, I find ML engineers, data scientists are looking for tools on GitHub first, oftentimes even before they would do a Google search. Exactly. And so I do find that companies are creating open source projects not because anybody really cares about having visibility into the code base, but because they want to be one of the first solutions that ML engineers or data scientists find. And then the last set of reasons I would say are kind of more authentic to the philosophy of open source, which is that for certain problems, there's kind of a long tail of integrations or extensions, or a need for extensibility. And in those cases, the open source community can actually make meaningful contributions in shaping kind of the nature of the open source project. And so nowadays, like when my startups are kind of thinking about their open source strategy, we're often kind of thinking about the various elements of open source. Like, do people need to see the code? Do you want it to be free? And by the way, like, you can create free software that is not open source. And are you willing to take contributions? Because if you're just putting something out there without the intention of engaging an open source community, like if all you want to do is like make it free and let people see the code base, like you can do that without having an open source product. I think the other thing that companies sometimes forget is that an open source product is a product. Like, it's one that you need to maintain. It's one where you have to respond to the community's requirements and other issues. So, it's not something that you just put out there and then like set and forget it. It needs to be intentional.
Yes,
So
completely.
yeah, that makes complete sense. I think a lot of the hot ML projects and stuff, we've seen Lyft open source flight, Uber has a open source Horovod. Like, so much of what we draw inspiration from has been, major companies open sourcing. And to some degree, they may have the resources, they may have the clout to draw attention to their project and set standards. What kind of resources do you think a startup has to focus on offering to an OSS project versus like a big company? And how do you kind of shape that component of the strategy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, I think many of the startups with whom we work, open source either will or will not be kind of a more fundamental part of their go-to-market strategy. And so it's less frequent where they're like just open sourcing a widget or component, and more often that it is either an open core model or they're open sourcing kind of a more significant part of their platform. So there's kind of a difference with regards to what they open source. But I think the question of how they approach it and how they kind of build a community around it is also super important. To be honest, I think like there's more of an onus on startups to solve really urgent and widespread problems than there is for some of these larger companies. Because again, for them, open source is a fundamental part of their strategy. And so, while a bigger company can open source something, and if it doesn't get adoption, like that's fine. For startups, like that can actually end up being the straw that broke the camel's back. So, they need to solve an urgent problem. They need to dedicate resources to it to ensure that they continue to engage with the community. And perhaps this should be obvious across both, but like people can see the code, so the code quality better be good. I think what we often find in how I advise my startups is like, if you think that you may open source something in the future, make sure that you are paying careful attention to both how you architect your code base, like you probably need to adopt microservices, but also like how you're writing the code, right as if this is going to be exposed to the entire world.
Got it. Yeah. So from the architecture and the sort of the software engineering side, companies need to pay a lot of attention. From a sort of, let's say, manpower or like allocation resources, do you see a lot of companies have like maybe a specific community manager, or maybe will they have like a team of software engineers dedicated to the open source project? How does that usually play out?
Yeah. So for early stage companies, I think like focus is absolutely critical. And often what we will recommend is that the entire team is actually dedicated to the open source project. And only when you have kind of a critical mass of open source user adoption and engagement do you start to shift focus to the commercial platform. So in almost all cases, I would say that like at a minimum, it's a 50-50 split between commercial platform and open source products, which again kind of highlights the need to make open source like more of a strategic move and not just something that's more tactical. In terms of who is engaged, I think certainly you want the engineering team to be able to interface with the community such that they get insights into what their requirements are, how people are using the project, and can kind of use those insights to inform how they're building it. We do increasingly see a role for developer relations and developer advocacy to helping community members understand other ways in which they could be applying this tool, or best practices associated with it. And I actually think this is a really kind of interesting phenomena in the ML community, because while there is kind of longer precedent and more people who are playing DevRel roles in software development, there are actually far fewer people in the ML community who have made the transition into DevRel. So to be honest, like that is a very hard role to hire for.
Totally. I am 100% with you on that, because I know a few companies that have asked me, since we're in the community and we know all the people in the community, they ask a lot, like, do you know anybody that would be good developer relations or evangelist? And honestly, it's really hard because machine learning engineers don't necessarily want to do that role, or it's not the idea or the job description. It's very hard to wrap your head around. It's not like with the DevOps space, or if you go into the Kubernetes sphere where that role is much more clear and it's defined. You don't have that. I don't think a lot of people understand what exactly that would entail here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, one of the challenges too is just that like ML is relatively complex. And so frankly, like, whereas in some software disciplines, you actually see non-technical people shifting into the DevRel role. In ML, I just don't know how that could happen. You need to kind of have at least baseline understanding of both the mathematics and software practices associated with ML.
So let's talk a little bit about this idea of consolidation. And we're going to jump onto your tweet storm now. And one of the things that jumped out at me right away was one of the tweets you talked about how consolidation is happening. And for me, or you said consolidation will happen. Sorry. Forgive me if I misquote you. I'm also a professional at that. So please correct me if I'm wrong, if I say anything incorrect here. The idea of consolidation for me is really interesting, because right now when you look at the diagrams of all the different tools that are out there, right, you see like hundreds of tools and hundreds of little like pieces that, oh, well, this tool does this small thing. And it's similar to when we look at like the CNCF landscape, you see that, except the CNCF landscape, that's been around for a long time and it warrants quite a few tools. Here in the machine learning space, I feel like there's so many that just pop up and they're solving this problem. And then it's hard to know, what exactly does this tool do? And is it going to solve the problem that I'm looking for? So when it comes to consolidation, and especially for us right now, we're trying to make a website that explains these different tools and explains the different pieces of the puzzle. And it's just been like, I have so many more gray hairs because of it, because it's like trying to figure out what exactly is going on and how to cut this pie. It's really a difficult question. And so I know there's been others that have come on here and talked about, well, we'll see congregation happening in these different parts of the stack, and you'll get like a stack, an MLOps stack. But I'm not so sure about that. So I want to hear what your thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think this is one of those areas where you just see this trade-off between kind of like flexibility, efficiency, and control. So right now, I think we've probably oriented towards way too many tools. And I think, what is generally happening is that ML teams encounter a problem. They go look for a solution. They adopt a point product. Now they have another problem. They adopt another solution. They adopt a point product. Or conversely, they adopt, an end-to-end platform, but the end-to-end platform may be suboptimal in certain ways. So either you have this constellation of point products, which you now need to maintain, you need to integrate, you need to negotiate with the vendors, or you have an end-to-end platform, but one that is not purpose-built or well-suited to your workflows in certain ways. So I'm not really a big proponent of end-to-end platforms. I think as ML adoption increases, we will increasingly also see disparate needs that cannot be easily reconciled with an end-to-end approach. But similarly, like as ML engineers, you shouldn't have to spend every other week renegotiating contracts with a vendor. So how does this get solved? Well, it has to get solved by the point products blending together. And there are some more obvious ways in which they might blend together. So for example, you think about the association of experiment management in CI/CD. Or you think about things like model monitoring and debugging. But then there are perhaps less obvious ways. A friend of mine, Eric Bernardson, who was the CTO of Better, he actually kind of put forth a really interesting framework for thinking about this. Now, what he said to me was that you can think about two separate point products or two separate parts of the stack and consider those together. Are the benefits of those two components being tightly coupled enough that you can overcome the switching cost of shifting one and adopting that more unified solution? And I think that that's a really kind of elegant way of thinking about what parts may be interlinked. So if, for example, you have a distributed training platform, and then you have a model deployment or model serving tool. Now, I, as a customer, want to adopt the distributed training platform, but I've already got a model serving tool. Are the benefits of switching off my model serving tool enough because it's going to somehow make my distributed training platform better? Like, probably not. So maybe those are two components that don't logically get blended together.
Yeah, and when you're talking about this, I realized the idea of these ML engineers going out and finding solutions, or more times than not, they also are saying, oh, well, let's build a solution. And what I've seen so many times, and this is a blog that's on me to write, Vishnu, this one is my next blog post, is something like, please don't start an MLOps company, because there are so many people that I see that say, hey, we had this problem at my last job, so I'm starting a company to fix it. And you're like, yeah, are you sure about that? Like, what makes you think that A, this problem is ubiquitous, and B, that you are actually like solving it in the best way? And so many people come into the community like, hey, we're trying to help with this. And you talk to them more and then you realize that the reason they're trying to solve this problem is because they had a really bad pain around it at the last company they were at. But the blog post will be around that. Like, are you sure that everyone has that pain, or it wasn't just specific to your company? So,
yeah. I mean, I'd say I see this particularly acutely at kind of the larger tech companies.
exactly.
So, if I'm at like Pinterest or Facebook, perhaps like I am actually struggling to train my large multitask embedding models because I have billions of images and text, et cetera. And I need to like identify the next training head that's going to be like most efficient, or next task head. That's not necessarily a problem that you have at a 30-person startup. So just as I mentioned, like I need to validate that like the pain points that I felt at Mattermark are pain points that persist today. I think founders who are coming at things from the mindset of like, I felt this pain point. I want to develop a solution for the rest of the market, need to go through a similar process.
Yeah, interesting point that both of you make about how people who come from big companies, hot companies, like, we've seen people from Lyft or Coinbase or many of the other companies that have really done great work at the companies that they were at, build sort of new MLOps companies. And yeah, as somebody that's at that 30-person company that you're talking about, like, that's not most of our needs. Most of our needs are, what are we really trying to do here? Do we have the data? Is the data structured the right way? Are our scientists writing good code? That's like what 90%. There's a lot more process than it is tools in some sense. Though tools can of course help with process. I guess one question that I had that really fits in neatly with where our discussion has been going has been, well, Demetrius is saying, let's be sure that the MLOps company you want to start is actually unique. Where do you see, in that same vein, where do you see MLOps evolving? I mean, you've invested in some interesting companies like OctoML, where we just saw, their Series B post, and we had a discussion in the community about their product. Metaphor Data, some very interesting companies that you're investing in. How do you see this overall MLOps industry evolving in the coming years, apart from the consolidation?
Absolutely. So I can talk about things that are kind of happening now, as well as like some of the questions that I'm exploring and trends that I'm seeing, further out into the future. So I think many companies have realized that their ML problems are actually data management problems. And you articulated this before, like, where is the data? How do I access it? How do I monitor data drift such that it doesn't significantly impact prediction quality? These are not straightforward data management problems in that you can just pick a tool that was designed for any data engineering use case and adopt it in the ML context, but they are still data problems. And I think those are the problems that are getting solved now and are going to kind of unlock ML scalability in the future. They're going to make ML teams a lot more productive. So in terms of where I see things going, one of the questions that I've been very kind of focused on, and this perhaps also relates to the gap between the FANG companies and smaller companies, it is really the kind of gap associated with structured and unstructured data. So when I'm curating projects to know, like, every other paper is a transformer paper, and people are applying transformers to computer vision tasks now, to video, and obviously to language as well. So everything is really based on text, images, and video. When I talk to people in industry, all of their use cases are based on structured data. And you often see this gap between research and industry, but the gap is much more associated with like solution complexity, if you will. Often it will be that companies are adopting simpler models, whereas like research is putting forth more complex models. So it was interesting to me to kind of see this gap emerge along the lines of like structured versus unstructured data. So I've been starting to kind of think about this problem, and going back to what you were saying before, I was just thinking through, okay, if I am an ML engineer at a company and I've got all of this like user generated or uploaded videos, like, what is the first thing that I do when I'm going to build an ML model? Let's assume that I have like a well-defined problem, like the project scoping is done. Well, the first thing I want to do is like explore the data and just get a sense of like the nuances and contours of my data set, which will inform, my choice of architecture, my choice of any sort of data pre-processing, and so on and so forth. So now I want to get a sense of my video data set. Like, what do I do? Do I just watch hours of video? Like, that seems pretty tedious. So maybe instead I'm just going to like look for a structured data set to solve my problem, because I can then query that data set and profile that data set. And like my ways of exploring that data set are much more well-founded. So carrying this forward, I think like if transformers are really kind of the new dimension or kind of the big wave in ML, like what we're going to potentially see in MLOps in the coming years are kind of better data management solutions, as well as deployment in engineering solutions for working with unstructured data that just help make it possible, frankly.
I think I really love how you put it, of going from unstructured data to structured data, because actually as an image-oriented company, we have to have structured data about each image, right? And a lot of my problem from an ML standpoint, and actually this is where Flywheel, not going to give too much details, but this is where Flywheel fits in for us, is in helping to understand the structured data around each image, right? And how that relates to the model that we're developing with unstructured data. So this relationship between structured and unstructured and clarifying that relationship is crucial, because companies really need to know what they're doing and where the flaws are, much more so than any research paper, right? And I think the idea of just taking a transformer model on whatever billions of words that OpenAI did and the way that they did, right? It's just like, okay, throw more data at the model. Like, from a research standpoint, fascinating, incredible work, but just could not fly at a company where everything is about risk management, right? And particularly for us, in a medical application, we need to know, where is our model weak? Where we know which classes are they protected classes under law? Do we need to, manage that kind of risk? It is completely unstructured. It's not acceptable to have a lack of understanding of your unstructured data just because it's unstructured, whereas that's forgivable in a research context. So the tooling around that evolving, I think that's a great point that you just made as somebody that's dealing with it right now.
And it goes to your tweet storm too, right? Like, I think in there, one of the things that you put was the frameworks are actually going to help us do our job, not just help us with research.
Absolutely. I think that is very true too. No, interestingly though, so I will give credit to Andrew Ng for this. He pointed out to me that while I can say that industry can't easily adopt some of these unstructured data models and transformer models, similarly in academia, there is kind of a lack of access to structured data benchmarks. So, what I'm hopeful of then is that if we can make, these structured data sets available to researchers, then we may actually also see, some meaningful advances of deep learning applied to structured data as well. So I think, that could also help usher in more frameworks that are targeted at the problems that people in industry face and can be kind of applied not just to do something cool with, the Wikimedia data set or, any image data set, but with, the set of traces or metrics that companies have.
Well, this has been fascinating. I really appreciate you coming on here, Sarah. Sadly, we have to wrap it up, but I could continue talking for ages. We may have to have you back on in a little bit and give us your new updates, what you've seen and how things have changed, if you've changed your mind on anything. And yeah, there's so many great points that you raise, especially this last one, this gap between research and professional and how it's a two-way street. We need to get the data, get both people sharing the data with each other so each party can benefit with that. I think that is a great point to be had. That's about it for us today. Vishnu, you got any last words?
Yeah, I think the structured unstructured data point, really agreed with it. And this is actually a challenge that I find in published data sets, particularly in healthcare, is you'll see a lot of times just a large number of images just released, and you'll see an academic group that says, hey, we de-identified the data, we cleaned it, and we were releasing 160,000 MRI scans to the world. Well, I actually really wanted all those structured fields associated with those images. I don't just want the images, right? The structure that tells me about the problem context is crucial. And I've often thought that, there is the next iteration of dataset publishing, that there has to be tools there. And I could see, even companies internally building tooling that allows for them to publish data sets for use by researchers from their data pools, and then allow sort of updating, and maybe that's a tool that then academics could adopt more easily, right? So definitely, maybe a blog post about data set publishing will be coming out, and we'll have to collaborate with you on that, Sarah. But thank you so much again for coming on. This has been a great conversation.
Absolutely. It's been super fascinating for me too. So thank you for having me.
Cheers. We'll see you all later. Have a great day.